Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's Knowledge Bank. Today's session is being presented by Shaun Harris, founder and managing director of Harris Associates, and he is going to be speaking to you about compartmentation, an unseen threat to life safety. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get through as many as possible at the end. The webinar is also being recorded today and will be available to watch back via our YouTube channel. That is all from me. I am now going to hand you over to Shaun.
Thank you, Vicky. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. As Vicky says, it's on the compartmentation unseen threat to life safety. Just by way of intro, Harris Associates, in the context of what we're talking about today, building surveyors, QSs, PMs, but clerk of works technicians, providing all sorts of compliance related services to the subject matter today. So please do get in contact if you have any queries or concerns where we might be able to assist you. So here we go, content of the presentation. So I've split it into 6. So the first section will be compartmentation explained, the what, the how and the why. We'll then touch on the statutory and regulatory landscape. We'll talk about key documentation, core considerations when it comes to compartmentation and remediation. I'm going to provide you with some feedback from the fire rescue services, and then we'll touch on the issue of competence. There might be some other snippets here and there. This actually is broadly a repeat of a presentation I did a couple of months ago, but there have been some developments over the last, or events actually, that have occurred over the last month or so, which might be mildly interesting, and I will cover those. So let's just jump into it. So what is compartmentation? So compartmentation is the subdivision of a building into smaller sections or units to essentially withstand and limit the damage or growth from a fire and to stop the spread of fire and smoke. And we do that by ensuring that we have fire resisting construction between the areas that you're trying to compartment. In terms of residential flats within a block, the way to consider this is that each demise, each flat is its own box, and that box should be fully contained and separated from the other flats and the common parts. So here you'll see, a visualization of what I'm talking about here. So it's vertical and horizontal compartmentation, as well as obviously to the common parts and also externally. Now, externally, we're into the realms of external facades and external wall systems, which is not the subject of today, but hopefully that visualization gives you a better feeling as to what we're talking about and why it is important. So that leads on to, well, how do we compartmentalize? So we achieve this through the provision of fire resisting walls and floors, or floors/ceilings. And the fire rating is usually between 30 minutes and 120 minutes. And that will depend upon the height of the building, the design, fire strategy for that particular building, which we'll come on to a little later on. There are special measures that obviously one needs to consider around openings. That includes doors, so that's flat entrance doors into common parts, but it also covers glazing, service penetrations, and ductwork. And I'll try and remember, but there's been an event that's happened over the last month or so regarding ductwork and ventilation, which has been a bit of an eye-opener, particularly where you have mixed-use premises. So I will hopefully remember to touch on that and give you an update on why that's relevant. So what are the core standards of performance? So we're still on to how. So the wall or floor must remain functional for the duration of that design fire resistance. So that's usually 30, 60 or 120 minutes. And that compartment, wall or floor, should not crack or develop holes that allow flames, smoke, and hot gases and so on to go from one compartment to the other. Okay, and that's done by having a suitable degree of insulation, and the openings are clearly a critical juncture. There is no point having a really a 60 or 120-minute fire-resisting wall, and the fire door within that is going to give you 15 minutes, or a duct within the flat, within the box, is going to accelerate the fire within a flat. So the openings and the relationship between from box to box, if you like, are absolutely critical. So, that's how we do it, and what the easy and how we achieve that. But why do we bother? Why bother with actually compartmentalizing at all? Well, the first reason is an obvious one. So it's for the preservation of life. It protects and subdivides escape routes, and the escape corridors and the stair enclosures, they need to be designed to the point or exist where they are protected and allow people to evacuate in a fire event or an emergency event. So you have refuge areas, protected lobbies, and firefighting shafts. The other preservation of life is it decreases the preservation of life aspect is that it decreases the risk to the fire and rescue service. And this is actually, when it comes to fire strategies, usually what you will find is that if you can find a fire strategy for your building, it will most likely focus on preservation of life in the context of visitors and people who live in those blocks, and also we focused on the risk to fire and rescue service during a fire event. It will put secondary to all of that will be the asset loss. The final point I made there is that the decent, proper compartmentation will support the adopted evacuation strategy. So really important, for example, for a stay put or defend in place strategy, where if there is a fire in a flat, only the occupants of those flat of that particular flat would need to evacuate, because the compartmentation is so sufficient that the fire is unlikely to spread at such a speed before the fire and rescue services come to attend the fire. So that's the first reason, preservation of life. Second reason, protection of property. Now, I've already mentioned that as far as fire strategies are concerned, is that the protection of property is secondary. But from a management perspective, of course, protection of property, protection of asset is going to be very, very important for your clients, for landlords, freeholders, leaseholders, residents, and of course, insurers. So, this is, the protection of property is reason number two. And this is important that you're able to evidence that the compartmentation is such that it limits fire and smoke spread, and that the compartmentation is effective enough that it attempts to contain fire at the point of origin. Compartmentation divides different building uses, users, risks, and activities. Particularly important, of course, when you have mixed use premises, so residential accommodation and flats in first floor and above, and then you may have a restaurant or an office use, or all sorts manner of retail and commercial premises. Divide effective compartmentation, dividing those asset classes or asset uses is critical to ensuring that you're protecting the occupants of both types of premises, but from an insurance perspective, you can evidence that if, for example, there's a fire in the non-residential part, that the residential part is duly protected. And of course, the final point I made on this page is that it limits, compartmentation effectively limits the claim costs and insurance premiums. Now, I'm not quite sure how many are on the call, but I suspect many of you will be property managers and you have been dealing with post-Grenfell increased insurance premiums, primarily related to facades and cladding and so on. But as I will touch on a little later on, the compartmentation problem is going to have an increasingly likely negative adverse effect on insurance premiums. if one can't evidence that the compartmentation is up to scratch. Okay, so we'll move on now to statutory, or the statutory and regulatory landscape. And you can see from this slide here that it's not simple. It's actually quite complex. So if we just take them in turn, so the regulatory reform fire safety order, I'm sure all of you will be familiar with that, and that dictates the fire risk assessments and the assessment of fire risk in mansion blocks. That's been around for many, many years, so you will be familiar with it. So you have the regulatory reform fire safety order, which of course is primarily based on an assessment of risk. We now also have the Building Safety Act, and that's introduced all sorts of different roles and responsibilities. And the reason why I put plus is because when you have high risk buildings, the remedying and the risk control when it comes to compartmentation is much more complex, particularly when it comes to planning out any compartmentation remediation works. And that is primarily to do with the amount of work you need to do, one, to evidence the problem, and two, to then engage with the building safety regulator, which I'll touch on later, in order to get building regulations approval for the remediation work. That leads on to building regulations. Now, building regulations primarily, as I'm sure most of you will know, deals with major works and new builds. The important issue here that I'm trying to make is that the standards of compartmentation that are enshrined within the statute that is the building regulations, they haven't changed much for decades. And so the standards of compartmentation that you will have in buildings that are 20 or 30 years old, for example, they should really meet the standards of today, because there has been little change in terms of the expected fire resistance for walls and floors, depending upon the design. Now, the building regulations, when it comes to remediation, the building regulations or the satisfying building regulations is likely to, well, it will be a requirement. So you will be expected to meet the requirements of the building regulations for any non-high risk building. So that's a building where the story height is under 18 meters. For any, for that type of building, it's less onerous or complicated, because you essentially follow a relatively well-trodden path of how to get approval, and you don't need to follow the BSR route, which is for buildings that are above 18 meters. So where you have a high-risk building, the complication of getting building regulations consent is significant and requires a lot more work. And again, I will touch on that later. Now, the bottom three, CE and UK CA market, multiple test standards, more changes coming, and the information provision of golden thread. So the first two, the changes to testing products has actually been put on hold by the UK government. There was going to be an alignment, more alignment with Europe, but last September, I think it was, the use of UK testing has been extended indefinitely. So that's less of a problem. But the multiple test standards are going to change. The government, the last government and this government, is absolutely committed to making sure that products are standard to a much rigorous standard, and that includes materials and systems around compartmentation, whether it's sealants or other systems to improve compartmentation within existing buildings, but also for new buildings too. The information provision and golden thread. Now, the golden thread, and I'm sure as a concept, it's not alien to anyone on this session, but is essentially geared towards high-risk buildings. But in essence, the sector as a whole is moving to much better information provision, both before works are carried out, but also during any remediation work, and then evidencing or being able to evidence via the golden thread of information upon completion. What we are seeing, and it's certainly what we are advocating, is that that information control and quality control and golden thread is actually being rolled out and adopted for not just high-risk buildings, but also for non-high-risk buildings, so the buildings below the 18 metres. Okay, so key documentation. So that kind of leads from the statutory and regulatory landscape discussion. So we have fire risk assessments, we have a fire strategy and evacuation policy, compartmentation surveys, fire door surveys, FRAWs, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the fire risk assessment of an external wall, and then we have as-built plans and layout drawings. Now, if you're a property manager or an asset manager, or if you have responsibility for a building, irrespective of whether it's high risk or not, that's a lot of documentation there. And what we find is they're not necessarily done in the right order, are joined up, and they can be quite disparate. So the fire risk assessments, the important issue here is that they go far enough to inform, one, the risk of your building, but they also need to tie in with, and it's critical that it does this, but very often doesn't, it's critical that it ties in with a fire strategy and evacuation policy, which then also ties into compartmentation surveys and fire door surveys. It also ties in with layout plans, as-built plans and layout drawings. The reason why I'm saying this is that my experience of reading fire risk assessments is that there is, or hasn't been over many, many years, enough reference to fire strategy. There may be a reference to what the understood evacuation policy is. It might, and that will usually be an assumption around stay put or defend in place. The fire strategy goes much further than that. And actually, it's my view that fire risk assessments and fire strategy go hand in hand. You can't have a satisfactory fire risk assessment without really understanding what the as designed or the adopted fire strategy is for your building. And that will then dictate whether and what compartmentation standards you need, which will dictate how many surveys or what type of survey you need, and does that include a fire door survey? Linked in with fire strategy, fire risk assessments. Again, my view is that you can't have a satisfactory assessment of fire risk within any of your buildings unless you have as-built plans and layout drawings. Without as-built plans and layout drawings, without the fire strategy, you don't know, or the assessor won't necessarily know, what rating, what fire resistance is required for each of the compartments within each of the boxes within your building. You don't know whether it's a 60-minute, 120-minute, 30-minute fire resisting. Without that, you cannot really effectively assess the risk of fire and smoke within your building. And the reason why I put this slide up is to illustrate just how complex this is, but how it hasn't been dealt with as being very complex for many, many years. That, I think, is set to change, partly because fire risk assessment, those who are carrying out fire risk assessments are starting to really understand that actually, yes, it's assessment of fire risk, but it's also about engineering as well. So fire engineering as opposed to just fire risk assessment. There may be some questions on this, which I'm happy to answer at the end, because this is actually fundamental to making sure that you genuinely have assessed your fire risk for your buildings. Okay. So what are the core considerations? So this is generally when you're faced with a compartmentation problem or a compartmentation scheme that needs to be rolled out. and they're not necessarily in order, but actually I suspect perhaps in the back of my mind I have put them in order. The first one on the left-hand side is residence and communication. This is absolutely critical, and actually when it comes to the changes in statute, particularly the Building Safety Act, putting residents at the centre of what we do as far as things like compartmentation concerned are absolutely key. And communicating with your residents is also key. Not just because it's good to keep those residents informed, but actually from a risk perspective, if you genuinely think, or your fire risk assessor has flagged up that you have a compartmentation issue and you may need to change, for example, the escape strategy for a short period of time, it's critical that that is communicated to the residents. Otherwise, nothing will change. And where there's uncertainty, people make the wrong assumptions. So residents and communication, absolutely critical, right at the top. Okay. Building height, the reason why I put that down as a core consideration is because your building height will dictate whether that building is considered a high risk. That will then impact on the fire resistance of corridors, escape routes, travel distances within those escape routes, numbers of fire escapes, and so on. So building height is also key. So anything above 80-metre story height, that's a much more complex issue to grasp and will need much more complex solutions. Consider the wider building issues and strategies, including services installations. So services installations is interesting. So we're all familiar with pipes and cables going from, say, from a common parts corridor into a flat or between other common parts areas, and there's holes around the cable because it's been done after construction, and it's all a bit of a mess. The other area, and often the unseen area, major risk, is around services that pass from flat to flat, and that might be a central duct. It might just which has all sorts of cables and pipes and drainage and what have you within it. But this is exacerbated when you have mixed-use premises, and that is linked to the next bullet point, which is adjacent building uses. So if, for example, you have a restaurant or a kitchen or a coffee shop or something, lower ground and ground floor, and residential's first floor and above, services such as ventilation and other exhaust ducts are key. And I mentioned, 10 minutes ago that I hope I remember. Now, there was a case, I can't remember what it's called now, but it was only about a month ago, where there was a fire in a restaurant and it spread up the building very rapidly. One, because the compartmentation wasn't very effective, but also the vent basically contributed hugely. One, it was a funnel. Two, it was full of grease and grime, which ignited. And so this became, this is becoming and should become an area that is put on not just consideration when you're looking at fire risk, but actually when it comes to maintenance of your buildings. Looking at that is a key area as well. Adjacent building uses is the next one, which I've spoken about. Reconnaissance, then assessment. So what do I mean here? So what I mean here by, we're now sort of moving into, we've got a problem. We think there's a compartmentation issue, and what do we need to do? And the reason why I put reconnaissance, then assessment is the way we handle it and the way it should be handled is that you need to reconnaissance the building, and that's the common parts, and it's also flats. You need to get into the flats, not to start opening up. This is just survey stuff. You need to understand the layout of your building, understand the layout of the flats. And for that, you will need, as I mentioned previously, layout drawings and plans. Because without that, you can't really see how everything is knitted together. So reconnaissance, then assessment. You can identify the key areas, including within the flats, and where you want to take samples, i.e. where you want to open up. So it's only once you've done your reconnaissance that you can then move to assessment and start planning the opening up. And we're moving down the bullet points now. So then you're into opening up. If you plan it properly and you have a really good feeling about the layout of your property within the flats as well as just more generally, you're going to minimize disruption and minimize destruction as part of the compartmentation survey process. Okay, material and product identification. What I'm talking about there is material and product identification that exists within your buildings, but also material and product identification of materials and products that you're going to use in order to solve the compartmentation issue. So identifying those and being absolutely certain about what you've got, this is a challenge as well as a consideration, because what often you find is that there's been an attempt to fill a hole or a gap or what have you, and there's no evidence as to what the product or material actually comprises. Scheduling a range of solutions and quantification of remediation. Now, what you want to be able to do, this is pre-contract, so pre-tender, pre-specification is really what we're talking about. You need to schedule the widest range of solutions to your compartmentation problems that you think you're going to face, or your surveyor or your assessor thinks you're going to face. Having those range of solutions scheduled out in as much detail as possible will then allow you to move to quantifying the likely or the estimated quantification of remediation per solution. Going back to the plans and layout drawings, this is why it's so important to have plans and layouts, because without those, it's quite difficult to get a feel for how you're going to plan those works, and also how you're going to actually quantify and work out how many different types of repairs you think you're going to have to carry out. Moving on to the other side, so we've got practical limitations, and what I'm talking about there is really sometimes trying to solve a compartmentation issue to 100% is very, very difficult to achieve. And so, yes, there will be limitations as to practically what you can do, and that will require involving a number of parties, possibly even the fire engineer and or fire rescue service, to say that this is reasonably as far as we can go. I'll touch on the point of reasonableness in a minute, and it's in relation to the developers who signed the pledge of the government remediation contract, which covers things like compartmentation. Remind me to cover that. I'll cover that off a little later on, just in terms of some of the approaches that we're seeing develop. Timescales, yeah, consider the timescales. Again, it's understanding from with contractors, the residents, and so on, what the timescales are for remediation. Let's run down the rest of these. Maintenance defects versus original legacy defects. This is inherently difficult to do. We're often asked to do a schedule where we're splitting what is likely to be a defect that relates to when the building was constructed, and separately identify what has happened or evidently happened since construction. Always very difficult to do, and actually very often they merge into one. The next bullet point is extent of reinstatement. So again, that's tied in with practical limitations. Door standards, so the difference between nominal, notional, upgraded, and certified. This is a funny area, because fire doors are one area that is looked at quite closely, partly because there's always an argument as to who owns the door. But the notional fire door is basically an older door that satisfied the standards of the day, whereas a nominal door is a more modern door that is not certified, but looks to do the job. When it comes to door standards, particularly flat entrance doors, very often this will be down to the judgment from those who are carrying out the surveys themselves. The certified doors, they will usually come as door sets, and they will have the relevant kite mark, which will give you the confidence that that door is fully up to the right standard. Contractor and contractor choice, design and build stroke PCSA. So this is an interesting one, and we can go around the block on this. So contractor choice is an obvious one. You need contractors who are expert in this area, who know what they're doing. Contract choice is an interesting one. So we have in the past used the design and build contract, where the onus is put on the contractor to design out the solutions. And that's linked with a PCSA. Now, PCSA stands for a pre-contract services agreement. It's in essence a mini contract. So a contractor would do the opening up themselves and work out during this mini contract phase what the works are like, the range of works that are going to be required. We are actually, there are pros and cons of that, and actually that can lend itself to, or it's more suitable for some larger projects. I'm happy to answer more questions on that. It's actually a subject that we could talk for an hour on, which we don't have the time for. Measurement of works completed, that will be key to make sure that the each and every area of remediation is signed off when it's completed. The certification and oversight and sign off is critical. The use of proper, this is linked into Gold Thread, but the use of proper QA and QC, quality control processes, software, is highly recommended to be used for these projects. And when that's linked in with plans and layout drawings and so on, it just lends another layer of evidence and robust confidence in what's been achieved. Roles and responsibilities, including the building regulations principal designer. So this building regulations principal designer is different to the CDM principal designer, but a building regulations principal designer is in essence the entity, the person, the company responsible for designing out the solutions. Sometimes that can be a consultant such as ourselves, and sometimes it's better placed to be the contractor. Fire rescue service input. I'll come on to the fire rescue service in terms of feedback that we've had from the fire rescue service. But when it comes to areas where you're perhaps limited practically by the problem that you're facing around compartmentation, and the need to be flexible or have some flexibility in terms of your solution, our recommendation, if possible, is to seek the input or at least collaboration and commentary from the fire rescue service. Okay, so this leads on to the feedback from the fire rescue services, and this is a developing story. And those of you who have a responsibility to manage both high-risk buildings and non-high-risk buildings in the residential sector, this is of strong interest, I would suggest. There is an increased focus / concerns in relation to stay put policies. The experience now informing the fire rescue services, is that the risk is not related to cladding now, but the concerns are growing around widespread problems with compartmentation. To add to that, just as an extra snippet, we work with a number of developers and who have signed the pledge, signed the government contract, and they know and they're planning for buildings, particularly those that have been built over the last 20, 30 years, compartmentation is going to be an enormous challenge. And the widespread concern of the fire rescue service is being mirrored by those who, like ourselves, are active within the sector. So this is still feedback from the fire rescue services. So there's a challenge in terms of balancing risk between likelihood and consequence. The poor building standards that they are seeing more and more now are not restricted to high rise. There's a real lack of understanding around original design intent and fire strategies. So this is a point I was making a few moments ago, is that there are too many fire risk assessments, in my view, that do not understand or don't go into enough detail because either the information isn't there or they don't have the time or their instruction doesn't cover it. There isn't enough onus on understanding the design intent and or fire strategy for that building. Without that, the fire risk assessment process is flawed to an extent. multiple documents that don't give a holistic picture. Now, this is from the fire rescue services. So go back to the slide that I had a moment ago, where you had all sorts of reports, fire risk assessments, FRAWs, compartmentation surveys, door surveys, and so on and so on. What the fire rescue services are telling us is that there's too many documents, and there's no one document or entity that is able to look at the bigger picture to give a much more holistic view, and without that, the actions are getting missed. Fire risk assessments that don't consider the risk of internal fire spread and simply recommending further investigations. So this is a criticism from the fire rescue services, is that there's too much fire risk assessment, sort of type 1, where we're not really sure, go and have a compartmentation survey carried out. And that is irking a lot of the fire rescue services, and we're seeing that in our instructions where clients are coming to us because the fire rescue services are stepping up in terms of their action and robust chasing, if you like. Fire risk assessments with addendums following receipt of an external war report, stroke FRAW, with no review or consideration. So just on this, so you will know, I'm sure, you have a fire risk assessment carried out. That fire risk assessment may then say, oh, there's something shiny on your building, the outside of your building, looks like cladding, I don't really know, go and get an FRAW carried out. Go and have an FRAW, and every FRAEW will tell you that then needs to be considered by the fire risk assessor, and whatever action needs to be taken, that it's incorporated within the assessment of that building. What the fire rescue services are telling us is that that doesn't happen. The fire risk assessment sits there with no changes, with an addendum that says refer to FRAW. Okay. And the last point there, again from the FRS, is there is this sort of default change from simultaneous evacuation from, say, a stay put policy. There's a lot of that without any clear rationale. And that's where maybe compartmentation has been highlighted, that you have an issue, but there is a sort of go straight to jail move, where you just go from where you are now to simultaneous evacuation without there being any clear strategic rationale behind it. Now, that may well be the right decision, but what the FRS are saying is that there doesn't appear to be any notable reason or rationale behind those decisions. Okay. So competence is key. Now, I read an article today, actually, and I can't remember, well, it was on LinkedIn, I think, and there was mention of the importance of competence. Now, the statute around everything we do now within the built environment, particularly around the risk assessment statute, is it's incumbent upon those in positions of responsibility that they ensure, one, they are competent, but actually those who they are engaging are also competent, and that goes all the way up to the clients needing to do that. So high-risk buildings, principal accountable person or persons, they have a responsibility to make sure that that whatever you're doing, and in this particular area it's obviously critical, that the competence of those individuals is up to scratch. So, you need to evidence, you need to be looking for what training has been carried out, whether that's via the FBA or the Institute of Fire Engineers. There's courses, diplomas. You want to be looking at third-party accreditation. You want to be looking for the QA processes. So QA, so the quality assurance, but also the quality control when you're on site. So that's the certification, but it's also the software solutions. There is enough software intelligence out there that adopting a software solution for something like compartmentation projects, right from assessment through to mediation, is an absolute must. You need to make sure that whoever's advising you has statutory expertise and project management expertise, and that's linked with the final point. There is not a typical building contract. So these remediation contracts, these compartmentation schemes, are not standard extex, internal refurb, you know, a little bit of maintenance here and there, roof renewal. They are not. You really do need to be on top of your game as far as understanding the nuances of these types of project. It's not a typical building contract, and everyone involved needs to evidence that they have expertise within this area in order to take part. Okay, so going back to what we said at the beginning, compartmentation, the unseen threat to life safety. Why solving the compartmentation issues will take longer and cost more than cladding remediation. Now, I've been barking on about this for a while now, and actually, when I'm talking to colleagues in other businesses, I talk to contractors and developers. This is certainly the direction of travel, and the thinking is that it will take longer and cost more than cladding. And the reason for that is that compartmentation defects affect more buildings, all heights and all sizes. So we're not just focused on anything above 11 or 18 meters like you might be for facade problems. So all heights and sizes. It's the potential, therefore, to affect all internal parts, including the flats. The challenge of liability or proving liability can be difficult. Tenants, landlord, developer. Nature of the work is specialized and expensive. And actually, I say expensive. So the actual repair bit might not be as expensive as one imagines, but very often it will be the reinstatement work that will be even more expensive. So, you know, you have a 500 quid repair above a ceiling, but that ceiling needs to be reinstated at a cost of £3,000 because it's got all sorts of finishes and complications and so on. So that's why the extent of remediation and reinstatement is going to be much more expensive. There is no fund available to provide a safety net here. There is no government scheme available to, if you're not in a building or a block where a pledged developer has signed a government contract to solve their ills of the buildings that they developed over the last 30 years. If you don't have that, currently, I've inserted the word currently in my words there is currently no fund available to provide a safety net. So at the moment, the cost of this is having to be met by freeholders, landlords, and essentially leaseholders through their service charges of their leases. I don't know, and I said this at the talk a couple of months ago, whether I've dreamt this, but I'm sure there has been chat amongst various meetings and groups within the remediation sector that there is possibly some funding that may become available, but there's certainly not a lot of noise around this at the moment. And I dare say it can't be relied on at this stage. The last bullet point there is legal challenges and action via statute will be expensive and lengthy, i.e. you don't have your building has compartmentation issues, it's going to be very expensive. The developer who developed the building or the contractor who developed your building is still around. They didn't sign the pledge, but actually the cost and length of time to solve those problems is expensive and may well take too long before the authorities come knocking on your door saying you need to do something. So we're going to move on to Q&A in a moment, but just before I do, just to give you a little bit of feedback of what I have seen over the last few months, I've talked about the importance of knitting in your maintenance regime to fire risk assessments, particularly around services where they go from one asset class, one type of building to another, or one area of your building to another, restaurant to flat or what have you. That I think will start to be more focus on that from, or there ought to be more focus on that from fire risk assessors and the fire rescue services. I'll also give you a little bit of feedback now. What we are seeing is that the fire rescue services, and it linked in with the feedback that I've provided you, is that they are becoming more and more robust than they were, say, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, in pursuing those who have an owner responsibility to make their buildings safe. And that is essentially landlords, freeholders, managing agents, and all of us who are involved. And we are seeing an increase in activity where the local fire rescue service, local fire authority, is taking action against a residential management company because they haven't moved quickly enough to resolve the compartmentation issue. So this isn't around cladding. This is about internal compartmentation. So we are seeing a tick up in that, and we know of at least one where an individual was taken to court and actually now has a criminal record. The problem that you will face, and we face it every day, is when we're talking about the production of layout plans and drawings and checking fire strategies and doing the job properly, that's expensive. And you will, I'm sure, find that there is, perhaps more often than not, a reticence from landlords and freeholders and leaseholders, directors. There's a reticence about doing anything or just seem to be doing something. I haven't got a solution for you there, other than to say I know it's an issue and we work very hard with all the parties involved on these projects to at least maintain a degree of momentum in making their buildings safer. The only other additional point I'd like to make, which I referred to earlier on, was we are hearing from some developers the notion of carrying out compartmentation works that are proportionate. And this kind of worries me a wee bit, because when it comes to compartmentation, I've talked about 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 120 minutes. They're really quite specific. The building regulations are quite specific about the standards that need to be achieved. There's not a lot of proportionality or judgment in terms of, does it really need to be done? I mean, there are some small areas, but on the whole, if the standard is X, then X is what you need to meet. And what we're hearing is there is a growing, not growing, there are some instances where there's a move to perhaps limit the amount of compartmentation to a proportionate level. The problem with that is that my idea of what might be proportionate is entirely, or could perhaps be entirely different to yours or someone else's. So that is, again, it's just a note, really a footnote from me, in that we are seeing that happen more and more. And I'm just going to quickly read down my notes to see if there was anything else that I was going to mention. I have the last thing then is just on higher risk buildings and the need to go through the relevant gateway to get building regulations approval. With high risk buildings, and I'm sure you know this anyway, but with high risk buildings, those above 18 meters story height, you need to apply for essentially consent to do your work. You have to go and make an application to the building safety regulator. And what that means for compartmentation works is you need to really be really right on top of every single aspect of the work that you're anticipating. That is inherently difficult for compartmentation works, where even if you had, say, a PCSA, like the mini contract to carry out the investigations, or even if you have engaged someone like ourselves to carry out a very detailed compartmentation survey, and you won't really know until you've stripped everything away as to how far you need to go. So making your application to the BSR as detailed as possible. And in order to do that, you will need fire strategy, you will need a decent fire risk assessment, you will need evidence of all the compartmentation assessments that you have done. It's an enormous amount of work, and you'll need that before you can even consider starting works on site. So look, that's probably enough from me. We've got 10 minutes left. I'm quite happy to answer any. I'm sorry about that. That was me going a bit crazy with the transition from one slide to another. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm not sure if I think there are some questions which I'm happy to answer.
So the first one, can you give an exact definition of building height? The basement included when half of it's below ground level on one side. Does it go to the base of the top floor or to the ridge of the roof?
Right. So when it comes to story height, the story height is the distance between the adjacent ground level of your building to the finished floor level, if you like. I always describe it as finished floor level of the highest flat in your development. There may be where you have a basement, for example, depending upon how that's configured. There may be a requirement to look at that a little bit more holistically in terms of whether it depends on the layout and how much space is around your basement area, I suspect. So there might be a case whereby the story height starts from that lower basement level. It's as far as compartmentation is concerned and fire risk assessment of your building. It's more likely that the story height that I've just described is more relevant for things like facades than it is for assessing the risk within your building from a fire risk assessment under the regulatory reform fire safety order. If I've not answered that, or satisfactory, do follow up and I'll try and answer it a bit clearer.
Another one, in terms of Victorian terraces turned into self-contained flats, mainly with wooden floor construction, how can these be protected from in terms of compartmentation?
Yeah, so we have in the past been asked, for example, on those types of buildings, we've been asked by fire risk assessors, as they come to us as building surveyors and say, can you give us a rating between the flats? So you might have steel, you might have timber, you might have lath and plaster. It's inherently difficult to put a rating on that because and this is where there's a real challenge between buildings that have been built in the last, say, 25, 30 years, where it's easier to work that out. In order to make a judgment, you can make a genuine educated guess. It's less about what the structure is, the timber joists and what have you. It is more about the detailing around things like services and the edges of ceilings, but also understanding the makeup of your ceiling. So if you have a very thick lath and plaster ceiling, for example, the chances are you will achieve something near 60 minutes, but that will depend on the thickness. So you can work these things out, and you can do so by having a survey carried out by somebody who understands how a Victorian mansion block is constructed, but it can be done.
How often does a fire compartmentation survey need to be done? We had our one done last year and I've carried out all the remedial work.
Well, that sounds excellent. So it's not about how often a compartmentation survey needs to be carried out. You will, of course, know that under the reform fire safety order, that fire risk assessments, it's every 2 years, I think you guys have to have them carried out, but whatever that is. So it's the fire risk assessment that will drive whether, or it should drive whether, a compartmentation survey is carried out. But if you have evidence all of the work that has been carried out, and that's kept on a central file for the building, then when the fire risk assessor comes along and carries out their fire risk assessment, there will be no need to suggest that a compartmentation survey needs to be done. If there's a feeling that from a maintenance perspective, so not a compartmentation survey, but from a maintenance perspective, planned maintenance may be allowing, between 5 and 10 years to check on a sample of areas to make sure that that compartmentation is in good order. But if the works themselves have been carried out diligently by a competent contractor, it's fully evidenced, then you shouldn't really need to have multiple compartmentation surveys.
What advice would you give when directors are refusing to spend funds on commissioning reports? Fire risk assessors are advised to remove fire alarm panels, but without giving any further information, can pass on the reasoning for this removal.
So this leans into the point I made about the reticence of people wanting to spend cash, and I can fully understand it. The last, excuse me, just got some water. The last, 3 years, there's just been one wave of statute and compliance after another for residential mansion block freeholders and leaseholders. And it's just another layer of cost, of course. But where you have, well, the 2 points there, where money isn't available or they don't want to spend it. My advice would be the messaging needs to be out there that, you know, if you don't do this, what happens next? And what happens next is fire authorities, or worse than that, there is a fire, and then they'll look at the messaging from you, from your consultants and your assessors and your experts and so on. And if you haven't done any of those things, then there will be an action against you. And this is what we had an inquiry coming on Friday. It's exactly what's happened. The leaseholders have collected money, they haven't done the work, they don't want to do the work, and the fire authorities lost patience and said, right, we're going to bring an action against you. So the action, I'm not suggesting you go and scare all your clients into this. You know, it's easy for me to say do so, but if people generally don't have the money, then it's going to be a tough one. But my advice there will be then, okay, you need to focus on what you can do positively, and that may lead to your point about it might be linked in with sort of changing evacuation strategy to simultaneous evacuation. Now that in itself is usually only a temporary fix and is not inexpensive. If you have, so it's not a straightforward answer, I'm afraid, but if you have consistently clients who are refusing to do anything, and there is just continually an over risk that the statute is not being complied with, then I'm guessing at some point that there'll need to be a question as to how risky that is for you as a business.
How do we establish a fire strategy for an old building where no records relating to the original construction exist?
So this is a great question, and that you won't find an original fire strategy for that for a building like that. But what you will need to do, and what you should do, is, and what is available is not fire risk assessors, unless necessarily fire risk assessors, but from a fire engineering perspective, that process needs to take place. And my view is that the fire risk assessment process, I said at the beginning, close to the beginning of the talk, that that process needs to become more fire engineering. So there are professionals out there, fire engineers, who can do so. In fact, at the leasehold conference I was at a couple of months ago, I won't name who was talking, but one of the very well-known provider, excellent provider of fire risk assessment services, essentially said that there was quite a big degree of upskilling required post Grenfell, post Building Safety Act, to up the game as far as fire risk assessment is concerned. It always amazed me why, for years, you would go and get a joint fire risk assessment and health and safety assessment for a mansion block with 50 flats, and it was only going to cost you 500 quid. There's a reason why it's costing 500 quid. It's not up to scratch. So in answer to your question, I'll stop ranting now. The answer to your question is that from a fire engineering perspective, you can do a fire strategy for your building, no problem.
How can we know how reliable fire risk assessors are? We've had 2 visits to the same building, each presented as different significant different recommendations. Widespread problem.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that, I'm afraid. It does lean into the question around competence. And I guess, you know, if I were a building owner, I owned a flat in a building, I would be digging very deep into the individual as well as the company who's carrying out these assessments, and actually really challenging, not in an aggressive way, but really challenging the thinking as to why certain recommendations are being made. You know, the fire rescue services, as I've said, they are also seeing fire risk assessments that don't go quite far enough. My view is that eventually, and this has happened quite a bit already since Grenfell, I suspect that the fire risk assessment cohort of providers will get slimmer, and the bigger fire risk assessment, fire engineering practices will keep raising the bar as far as quality is concerned. I suppose the only thing I want to add to that is, so if you wanted a surveyor, for example, you would go to the RCS. You would go to the RCS and you could, you know, do your own searches and make sure they're regulated and they've got the right experience. You know, there are institutions, you know, whether it's the Institution of Fire Engineers or the others, to actually dig deeper. And the other thing is to take the time and actually, if you understand what the minimum and maximum requirements are, you know, don't just instruct them to do X, but put together a quite detailed brief about your expectations when it comes to the delivery of things like fire risk assessments.
So once you know you need compartmentation remedial works and are waiting for BSR approval, should you change to simultaneous evacuation? Is full application needed, or can we just notify the BSR that works will be taking place under a different procedure of the same regulations?
Right, so if the building's high risk, you won't be able to start any work until you've got BSR approvals. So that's that one. In terms of whether you will need to change to a simultaneous evacuation policy, that should be that falls under the remit of the fire engineer / fire risk assessor. And this is where the proportionality thing may be more relevant, in that a change into the SIM-evac might be the best route, maybe because of the complexity of the building or the height of the building or something. But that is usually within the remit of the fire engineering profession. So Vicky, you've just appeared. Am I over?
We've gone slightly over. I'll let you carry on finishing, but I'm conscious there's still questions coming in and I don't want to keep you there all day.
I don't want to keep anyone here who doesn't want to be here, but I'm also happy just to stick around and answering some questions. So
Okay.
we'll keep going for another few minutes. That's
Sure,
okay.
yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So can you comment on the earlier comment that we've also seen fire risk assessors advising to remove fire alarm panels in buildings without any further information as to why?
Right, okay, yeah, so I didn't pick on that. So when it comes to evacuation strategy, it's usually either, sometimes it's a combination, but that's with complex buildings, but it's usually either a stay put and defend in place, i.e., you know, there's the compartmentation is good within your building, and you don't need everyone to evacuate the building when there's a fire. So that's stay put and defend. The SIM-evac policy is literally everyone that leaves the building. Now, the reason why your fire risk assessor may have said get rid of the panel is because it might be that in your building, and obviously I don't know, having a mix of an alarm panel that, if it goes off, makes everyone leave the building, but also have a stay put policy in place, that can be quite confusing. So I have certainly seen over the years where making a recommendation to remove a panel has been recommended because you don't need one or it may be that type of panel. You don't need that panel if you haven't got a simultaneous evacuation policy. Now, if you have a stay put policy, then what you would ordinarily have is, one, your compartmentation is great, your flat entrance door is up to scratch and what have you. But there may well be a panel with an alarm, but that is just done at a local level, rather than alarms going off within each of the flats. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but that might be the reason, is because you've got a mix of a panel or detection system that suits itself with sim evacuation policy, but you've actually got a stay put policy in place. So I've seen that before, where the engineer, the fire risk assessor has suggested that you move that out.
Can you request a fire officer to attend a building that you manage if you're worried about the safety of the building of the occupants without making the fire aware?
I guess the answer is yes. You can do anything, but as to whether you're likely to get them to attend, I don't know. Was that fire officer or fire?
Fire officer.
Yeah. So from the fire authority, our experience is that within London, for example, that's unlikely, just because they seem to be overly worked and very, very busy. And actually, our experience within London, funnily enough, is that they are the fire authority. It's not that they're less robust in what they're doing, but they're outside of London. There are fire rescue services that are more willing to launch actions against those who haven't carried out the remediation. There's nothing to stop you going to the fire authority to try and get them in order to get something going. That's happened on a couple of buildings where we've been brought in, where the leaseholders or residents have just been exasperated by the landlord or freeholder or what have you, and have contacted the fire authority directly. The only sort of caveat to all of that: be careful what you wish for. The most immediate thing you might want to do is, perhaps align yourself to the notion that you might go to them, but trying to get the people who are in a position to do the right thing, getting them to do it first would be the preferable option, I would imagine.
And the last question: do you see any speed with BSR applications? All organisations involved need cash flow, and this would slow the process if these experts look elsewhere for business opportunities.
Sorry, again?
Do you see any speed with BSR applications?
The BSR, as I'm sure most of you on this know, is I think it will get it right, but it's very slow. And there is no speeding up at the moment, despite what you may hear from officials. It is an expensive endeavour, I agree. But yeah, it is a slow process. But of course, the BSR is just for the high risk buildings. For buildings below, you things should be more quicker. Okay, that's it, Vicky. If there's anything, obviously, I'm happy to receive any other questions afterwards, which is fine.
Yeah, of course. I can, if anyone wants to get in touch with you, I'm more than happy to pass on your details and a copy of the slides. Thank you so much for presenting today, and thank you both for staying to answer those questions and taking more of your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you again for everyone who has joined us today. If you'd like to join more of our webinars, then you can see what's coming up on the News on the Block website. If you would like to watch Shaun's webinar back, it will be available on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you both for presenting today, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.